Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Let's get comfy and relaxed and let's begin. Story 1. I thought I was alone. That was the whole point. Miles away from civilization, nothing but the hush of the Appalachian woods and the quiet crackle of my campfire. I wanted the solitude. I needed it. The weight of the world had pressed too hard on my chest for too long, and I craved the silence, the stillness. But the woods were never truly silent. The trees whispered. That's what I told myself. Anyway, just the wind moving through the leaves, a soft rustling, nothing more. But sometime after midnight, the sound changed. It wasn't random anymore. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, half dozing in the warmth when I first heard it. A slow, deliberate whisper drifting through the branches. My skin prickled, but I forced a breath and listened harder. Probably just my imagination. Probably just my name. I heard my name. It wasn't loud, wasn't clear, but it was there, hidden in the rustling of the trees. A slow, drawn-out Jocelyn. I sat up fast, my stomach twisting. The fire cracked, sending a spray of embers into the darkness, but the voice was gone. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the trees. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the trunks, the underbrush, the empty spaces between them. Nothing, just the forest, thick and unbothered. I exhaled and let out a shaky laugh. Jesus. The isolation was getting to me. That, or I was just so used to the noise of the world that my brain couldn't handle the quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Watching, listening. I forced myself to relax and banked the fire for the night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent, and lay still, waiting for sleep to take me. It never came, because the whispers didn't stop. They came in waves, rising and falling, never quite clear enough to make out, but always there. I held my breath, straining to hear, and then, just a hair's breadth away from the nylon of my tent, my whole body went cold. I sat up fast, heart pounding, scrambling for my flashlight. I unzipped the tent in one frantic motion and shined the light outside. Nothing, just the trees, tall and unshaken, standing in silent witness. I scanned the forest, sweeping the beam left to right, my breath coming fast. And then I saw it, a shape. A shadow crouched between the trees. Not an animal, not another camper, something else. The shape moved, not like a person, not like anything that should be walking in the woods. It jerked forward, its limbs twisting, contorting, its head cocked too far to the side. And it was laughing, low, guttural, like a chuckle that didn't belong to a human throat. I didn't think. I ran. Didn't grab my pack. Didn't grab my knife. Just bolted, my boots slamming against the cold earth as I tore through the trees, the flashlight bouncing in my shaking hand. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. But the whispers followed. They moved with me. Not just behind me, but beside me, ahead of me. They curled around the trees, snaking through the air, laughing, calling my name. Then my foot caught on something, an exposed root, a rock, I don't know, and I hit the ground hard. Pain exploded in my knee, my palms scraped raw. My flashlight tumbled away, spinning, its beam flickering wildly through the trees. And in that sickly yellow light, I saw them. Figures, not just one, but dozens, standing between the trees, bodies thin and elongated, their heads cocked too far to one side, their eyes. Jesus Christ, their eyes. They had no eyes, only dark, gaping holes where their faces should have been, and they were whispering. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hand hit something hard, my flashlight. I grabbed it, lifted it, and they moved, not like people, like shadows slipping between the trees, shifting, bending. And I understood something then, something deep in my bones. They weren't moving toward me. They were moving above me. I barely had time to look up before the branches above me came alive. The trees shook, not from the wind, but from something in them, something shifting through the leaves, curling around the limbs. And then a voice, clear, sharp, right in my ear. Run. I didn't hesitate. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. I didn't stop until I saw the glow of my dying fire through the trees. Didn't stop until I was throwing myself into my truck, slamming the doors, turning the engine over with shaking hands. I floored it, and in the red glow of my taillights, I saw them one last time, standing at the edge of the trees, just outside the fire's dying light, watching, whispering, laughing. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. I never went back for my gear, and I never went back into those woods again, because some places weren't meant for people, and some things weren't meant to be heard. Story 2. I don't know why I chose that trail. Maybe I was feeling bold. Maybe I was tired of the same routine hikes, the same crowded campgrounds with their controlled little campfires and the hum of other campers nearby. I wanted something different, something isolated. So, I found myself deep in the Oregon wilderness, miles from anything, with nothing but the weight of my pack and the sound of my boots crunching against damp leaves. It had rained the night before, and the air smelled of wet pine and earth. The only other noise was the occasional bird call, but even that faded as the sun dipped behind the trees. I found a clearing just as dusk settled in, a small patch of flat ground between towering firs. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, untouched. The kind of place where you could believe you were the last person on earth. I was setting up my tent when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, a shadow standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. I squinted, my hands frozen on the tent pole. The figure didn't move. It was a man, tall, lean, standing perfectly still between the trees. I couldn't make out his face in the dim light, but I could feel his eyes on me. I lifted a hand and waved, feeling stupid, like maybe he was just another camper who'd wandered off the trail. He didn't wave back. He just tilted his head to the side. Not a normal, curious tilt, but something unnatural, too sharp, as if his neck had no bones. A chill crawled up my spine. "Hey," I called, trying to sound casual. "You lost?" No response, no movement. The forest around him seemed too still. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had died. Even the trees felt like they were holding their breath. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling over the zipper on my bag. When I finally clicked it on, the beam cut through the gloom, landing right on him. My stomach lurched. He had no eyes, just smooth, empty sockets where they should have been. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The flashlight shook in my hands, and for a second, I convinced myself I was seeing things. A mask, a trick of the shadows. But then he took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, like he was testing the air between us. His head tilted again, the same awful angle, and his lips parted slightly. Not to speak, just enough to show teeth. I turned and ran. My car was a mile away, parked at the end of the dirt road where the trail began. I sprinted, crashing through the underbrush, my heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight beam bounced wildly in front of me. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me. I didn't. That was worse. By the time I reached my car, I was gasping for air. I yanked open the door, threw myself inside, and slammed the locks. My fingers fumbled for the keys, but when I looked up, he was gone. The tree line was empty. No movement, no shadow, just the dark stretch of forest staring back at me, silent as a graveyard. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to drive, to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I left now, if I ran, something worse would happen. So I made the worst decision of my life. I stayed. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe I just didn't want to admit how scared I was. But after nearly an hour of nothing, I convinced myself I had imagined it. A trick of the light. A weird shadow. I was in the middle of nowhere, alone, and my mind had played a game on me. I drove back to my campsite. The fire was still smoldering when I got there. The tent stood undisturbed. Everything was just as I left it, but the forest still felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. I forced myself to shake it off, crawled into my sleeping bag, and told myself I'd laugh about this in the morning. But then, I woke up. It was still dark, the kind of pitch black that makes you forget which way is up. I didn't know what time it was. I only knew what had woken me. Breathing, not mine, soft, ragged, just outside my tent. I went rigid for a long, horrible moment. I just lay there listening, my own breath caught in my throat. The sound was close, too close, just inches from the thin fabric of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing stopped. Then, a slow dragging sound, fingertips trailing along the side of my tent. My whole body seized up, my muscles locking in terror. I wanted to scream, wanted to unzip the tent and bolt for the car, but I couldn't move. The fingers trailed across the fabric, asterisk, asterisk, once, twice, asterisk, asterisk, and then stopped right next to my head. A whisper. I see you. I never unzipped a tent so fast in my life. I burst out, flashlight in hand, its beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, no one, but the trees in front of me weren't empty anymore. There were handprints on the trunks, smudged and dark, like something would have been dragged across the bark, leading away from my tent. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I drove through the night, down winding roads, until I reached the first gas station I could find. I sat in the lot until the sun came up, my head on the steering wheel, shaking, listening for something that wasn't there anymore. I never went back to that trail, but sometimes on quiet nights, I still wake up thinking I hear it, breathing, right next to my bed. Story 3. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who could get scared in the woods. I mean, sure, I had my share of campfire ghost stories when I was younger, but that was always the kind of thing you tell around a fire in the safety of daylight, right? But this wasn't like any story I'd ever heard. This was real. It started like any other hike, the kind where you lose track of time, getting lost in the rhythm of your boots crunching on the trail and the quiet hum of the forest around you. I'd been walking for hours, deep into the heart of a forest that stretched on for miles. There were no signs of other hikers, no sounds of civilization anywhere. It was just me, the trail, and the forest. As the sun began to dip low, painting the sky with deep purples and oranges, I decided it was time to find a good spot and pitch my tent. The thought of sitting down to a warm meal, maybe cracking open a beer and watching the stars come out, was all I needed to push on for another few miles. So, I set off the trail, weaving through trees until I found a small clearing, a perfect spot to camp for the night. I got to work, tent up, stove on, food ready. The air was cold now, a reminder of how quickly the nights could shift when you're out in the wild. As I sat down on a nearby log, the last bit of daylight disappeared behind the horizon. That's when I saw it. A campfire. It was small, but it burned bright. It was about 50 yards away, just past a grove of trees. I thought, for a moment, maybe I wasn't alone in this vast forest after all. Relief washed over me. There was someone else out here. Someone who could keep me company, maybe swap stories over the fire. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight, and started walking toward it. The trees were dense, but the glow of the fire cut through the branches, guiding me closer. The smell of burning would fill the air, sharp and comforting. I quickened my pace, eager to meet another camper, maybe even make a new friend. But as I got closer, something happened. The fire flickered. I thought maybe the wind was picking up, or the flames had shifted. But no, it wasn't the wind. The fire blinked out. Just like that. Gone. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, cutting the light. I stopped dead in my tracks, standing frozen in the dark. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam dancing over the empty patch of ground where the fire had been just seconds ago. There was nothing, no one. I stepped forward, my boots crunching against the leaves, but there was no sign of anyone. No tent, no campfire remnants, no bags, no footprints, nothing. It was as if the fire had never been there at all. I turned back toward my camp, my pulse quickening, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe some other hiker had put the fire out before they left. But as I stumbled back to my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I tried to brush it off. I convinced myself it was just the isolation, the way the mind can play tricks when you're alone in the woods. I ate my meal, sat by my own campfire for a little while, and then crawled into my tent. I zipped myself inside, curled up in my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I should have known better than to think it was over. In the dead of night, I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first, I thought I was dreaming, that maybe the fire outside my tent had flared up again, but no, this was different. This was closer. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. The smoke was thick, sharp. It filled the small space of my tent, and I realized the fire wasn't just outside my tent. It was all around me. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quickly. I expected to see flames crackling in the darkness, but when I looked outside, all I saw was the flicker of a fire, barely visible in the distance. It was the same spot, the place I'd seen the fire earlier. The same small glow in the distance, but now it was different. The fire was burning bright, but this time it wasn't right. It was too still, too perfect. The flames didn't dance. They didn't flicker. They just sat there, flickering in place, as though frozen. I stepped outside, still holding the flashlight. The air around me felt dense, heavier than before. There was no breeze, no rustle of leaves, just silence. I walked toward the fire, my boots dragging in the dirt, my breath shallow. With every step, the fire seemed to grow brighter, closer, but I didn't hear anything. Not a crackle, not a pop, just the smell of smoke. By the time I reached the spot where the fire had been, I realized I couldn't see my own footprints in the dirt. It was as though everything I had done since arriving, setting up my camp, walking toward the fire, was wiped away, and then the fire blinked out again, just like before. No wind, no cause. It was gone. I stood there in the dark. I don't know how long. I could still smell the smoke, feel the heat on my skin, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, silent woods. I didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the fire, its glow, its warmth, but most of all, its eerie stillness. I kept thinking, kept hoping that maybe the next time I looked outside, there would be someone there, a hiker, a camper, something, anyone. But there wasn't. When the sun finally rose, I packed up and left without a second thought. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen, whatever had been out there, wasn't meant for me. To this day, I can't explain it. I can't explain why I saw that fire or why it vanished like it did. But I know this. There are places in the world that aren't meant to be explored. Some things out there aren't meant to be understood. And when you walk alone in the woods at night, sometimes the light you see, it isn't meant for you. It's meant to lead you somewhere, or maybe to something. Story 4. I had always prided myself on my ability to handle solitude. There's something about the stillness of the forest, the way it breathes, the way it lets you think without the distractions of the world. It was the reason I went on that trip, the reason I found myself alone in that tiny clearing deep in the woods. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees when I finished setting up my tent. I was about to start a fire, but something inside me, something primal, told me I needed to gather more wood first. It wasn't an urgent feeling, just a nagging thought, a whisper that suggested I'd feel better if I found some more dry branches before the night truly settled in. So, I walked a little farther than I normally would have, my boots crunching against the frost-hard earth. The air was crisp, each breath feeling sharp as it rushed into my lungs. The woods were quiet, but in that eerie, heavy way that feels like something is watching, waiting. It was a typical evening in the mountains, where everything feels suspended between day and night, where the shadows grow longer and thicker the farther you wander. As I bent down to gather another branch, I heard it, a giggle. Soft at first, a child's giggle. I straightened up, my heart skipping in my chest. At first, I thought it might have been a bird or some animal making strange noises, but no. It was too deliberate, too human. It wasn't a laugh, not exactly. It was higher, lighter, like the kind of sound a little girl would make when she's hiding behind a tree, watching someone. I turned, expecting to see a child, maybe one of the other campers' kids, though I didn't remember seeing anyone else in the area. I scanned the trees, the rustling leaves, the dense thicket surrounding me. Nothing but shadows and branches. But then, there she was, a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, standing in the middle of the clearing. She was barefoot, her dress, pale and tattered, flowing in the wind like it was caught in an invisible current. She was staring at me, her face eerily still, her large eyes fixed on me with a gaze that felt too old for someone her age. She wasn't smiling, but her expression wasn't quite sad either. It was almost blank, as if she was waiting for something, or perhaps watching for something. I blinked. The girl didn't move, but when my eyes opened again, she was gone. No running footsteps, no rustling leaves, just the wind and the trees. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I'd been alone in these woods for hours, after all. The silence messes with your head, makes you see things that aren't there. I finished collecting the wood quickly and hurried back to the safety of my tent. I told myself it was nothing, just a hallucination brought on by the stillness. But that night, as the fire crackled softly outside, I heard the giggle again. It was faint at first, like the memory of a sound you thought you'd forgotten, but then it grew louder, clearer. Right outside my tent, I lay still, my heart thumping in my chest. Was someone playing a prank on me? It didn't make sense. No one else was here, at least not that I knew of. The campgrounds were miles away. The giggling continued, growing louder, more distinct, until I could almost feel the small breaths of laughter brushing against the thin fabric of my tent. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just the wind or the distant calls of animals in the night, but it didn't work. It was too human, too familiar. It was the giggle of a child who wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands shook as I reached for the zipper. Slowly, I pulled it open, the cold night air rushing in. I half expected to see nothing, maybe a trick of the light or the shifting shadows of the trees. But she was there, the little girl, standing just outside the tent, her pale dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. This time, she was smiling, but it wasn't the smile of a child. No, it was something else, something twisted, like she knew a secret that I wasn't supposed to know. Her eyes, those huge, dark eyes, never left mine as she tilted her head, as if she was considering whether or not to speak. I froze, unable to move, unable to even breathe. The air in the clearing felt thick with something I couldn't describe. Fear? But it wasn't just that. It was as if the very forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, without a sound, she vanished. Not in a way that made sense. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, no fading away. 1 second she was there, and the next there was nothing. The clearing was empty. The woods were still. I closed the tent flap quickly, trying to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, that I was too tired, too alone for too long. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The giggle never stopped. It echoed in the back of my mind, a soft sound that never fully went away. In the morning, I packed up and left. I didn't stay to explore further. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to go back to that place, to that clearing. As I made my way back down the trail, I looked over my shoulder one last time, and there, just behind a tree, I saw her again. The little girl standing still, watching me, smiling. And this time, I didn't blink. I didn't have to. I just turned away and kept walking. Story 5. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed it. The tree. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was just a tree, big, twisted, with a knot in the center like some kind of gnarled heart. It stood alone, just off to the side of my campsite, where the firelight barely touched it. I didn't pay it much attention at all. Trees were trees, right? I had been hiking alone in the woods for days, enjoying the peace, the silence. Being out here was supposed to be about getting away from everything. No distractions, no interruptions, no noise. Just me and nature. But that night, as I sat by the fire, it started to feel different. Unsettling almost. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. And when I glanced over at the tree, I thought I saw something strange. I wasn't sure if it was the flickering of the firelight or if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I swear the bark looked different. I shrugged it off. Probably just the shadows, I thought. But the next time I looked at it, I realized something. The bark wasn't just rough. It had shapes carved into it. Faces. I stood up, suddenly feeling a little too exposed. The faces were subtle at first, barely noticeable, like someone had scratched them lightly into the surface. But the more I looked, the more I saw. There were dozens of them, scattered across the trunk, some of them small, some of them large. They were all human faces, but none of them looked right. Some were grinning in a way that didn't seem natural, like they were caught in some twisted mockery of happiness. Others were contorted in pain, their mouths open in silent screams. The faces shifted as if they were alive. I stepped closer to the tree, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I reached out to touch the bark, and as my fingers brushed over it, I swore I felt something move beneath the surface, something shifting. My heart skipped a beat. No! I jerked my hand back, as if the tree itself had burned me. But the faces stayed, unchanged, still grinning, still screaming, still staring at me. I couldn't leave. I'd set up camp far from any trail, and the sun was already starting to set. There was no way I was going to pack up and leave in the dark. The woods were too deep, too isolated. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I tried to ignore it. I forced my eyes away from the tree, and I went back to the fire, trying to forget the faces, the strange shifting bark. I tried, but I couldn't. I lay in my tent later that night, staring at the ceiling. I thought I heard rustling outside. My heart pounded, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake coming out here alone. The silence of the woods felt heavier now. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if the very trees were watching, waiting. It wasn't until I closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep, that I felt it. The feeling. Something was watching me. The sensation was so strong, so intense, that it froze me where I lay. My skin prickled. My heart raced. I forced my eyes open, glancing nervously at the tense walls, listening intently to the sounds of the night. The rustling outside was louder now, and I heard something faint, a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was coming from the tree. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but the longer I lay there, the harder it became to breathe. The whisper grew louder, and then I swear I heard a laugh. I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. I threw off my blanket, grabbed the flashlight, and rushed outside. The fire was little more than a glowing ember now, casting long, eerie shadows over the campsite. And there it was, the tree, standing tall and silent in the dark, its twisted branches reaching up like fingers to the sky. I walked toward it, flashlight trembling in my grip. I shined the light on the trunk. The faces, they were still there, but now they were different. The expressions had changed again. The faces were twisted, angrier this time. They were no longer just carved into the bark. They were alive. The eyes seemed to follow me, and I could almost hear them whispering, urging me to come closer. I was frozen. I couldn't move. My feet were cemented to the ground. The whispering grew louder, and the faces, I swear, started to move. They twisted and warped, their mouths opening wider, their eyes bulging in shock and fear. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of something I couldn't explain. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the faces was mine. I backed away, the flashlight dropping from my hands. The beam of light flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. The whispering stopped, but something else started. The sound of scratching, sharp and relentless. I ran. I didn't even think. I just ran, stumbling through the underbrush, hearing the sounds of the forest around me. The branches scraped at my skin as I pushed through, my breath ragged in my throat. I didn't stop running until I reached the clearing by the stream, the moonlight casting its pale glow over everything. I collapsed, gasping for breath. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. The next morning, I woke up to a sickening sense of dread hanging over me. I hadn't dared to go back to the tree, but now, the day's light revealed the forest in all its calm. Too calm, I packed up quickly, eager to leave this place behind. When I reached the tree, I stopped dead in my tracks. I had to look. I had to know. My face. It was carved into the bark, right in the center, staring back at me with an expression of pure terror. I backed away, my knees shaking. I didn't look back as I gathered my things and fled. I didn't stop until I was safely off the trail, surrounded by the sounds of civilization once again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the tree was still watching me. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. I don't know if it was some twisted trick of nature or something far worse. But there's one thing I know for sure. I'll never set foot in those woods again. And every time I close my eyes, I swear I can still feel those eyes on me. Waiting, watching, always watching. Story 6. I had never been the type to scare easily. Growing up in the small town of Millwood, I had learned how to handle the dark, how to navigate through the dense woods surrounding our home without the slightest hint of fear. So, when I decided to spend the weekend camping alone deep in the Black Hollow Forest, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Just me and my backpack, and the trees, silent, still, and safe. The sun had just set when I reached the spot I'd chosen for my campsite. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that could only be found in places where civilization was miles away. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and watched the flames flicker against the growing darkness. The air was crisp, the kind of cool night air that had a hint of winter in it. Everything felt peaceful, the way a perfect evening should. I spent the next few hours cooking a simple meal over the fire, lost in thought as the flames crackled. No one else was around. The world seemed far away, almost like it had forgotten me for a while. I had left behind the noise of work, the hum of social media, the chatter of everyday life. Out here, there was nothing but me and the stars, and that was enough. After I finished my dinner, I extinguished the fire and crawled into my tent. The air had turned colder, and the night seemed to press in on all sides. I zipped myself in, settled into my sleeping bag, and stared up at the thin fabric above me. It didn't take long before I found myself drifting off to sleep, lulled by the sounds of the forest and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Then it came. The first whisper wasn't loud, almost too soft to hear, but it was unmistakable, like a breath, a murmur just outside the edge of hearing. I froze, my body stiffening with that ancient, primal sense of danger that tells you something isn't right, even when you don't know why. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, but still barely a sound, like someone standing right beside me, murmuring into my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I sat up instantly, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice had been so clear, so distinct, it felt like the words had been carved right into my brain. I grabbed the flashlight next to me, my hands trembling slightly as I clicked it on. The light flickered to life, casting harsh beams of illumination against the inside of the tent. It was empty, completely empty. The darkness beyond the thin walls of the tent pressed in like a suffocating blanket. But inside, nothing had changed. I was alone, but that didn't ease the feeling gnawing in my gut. I blinked, took a few deep breaths to steady myself. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe I had imagined it. Or maybe it was the stress of being out here alone for the first time in a long while. But then, just as I was about to lie back down, the whisper came again. This time, it was softer, more insistent. It seemed to crawl across the air like a shadow, and it came from outside the tent. "You shouldn't be here." The words were identical to the first time, but now they seemed to resonate with something deeper, something that felt older than the trees surrounding me. My pulse quickened. This was no accident. This wasn't just a trick of the wind. I shoved my head into the sleeping bag, trying to block out the voice, but it didn't stop. The whisper came again and again, repeating my own words from earlier in the night. Words I had said aloud without thinking. "I'm just here to camp. You shouldn't be here," the voice replied, as if mocking me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to shut out the voice, trying to block it from my mind. But the words kept coming, each one heavier than the last. The air in the tent felt thicker now, as if it was pressing in on me. The space was smaller, the silence heavier. I could almost feel the presence outside, like something was standing just beyond the fabric of the tent, waiting. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. But I knew one thing. I wasn't alone. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, but the voice cut through it like a blade. "You shouldn't be here." I ripped the zipper open and bolted from the tent, my feet stumbling on the uneven ground as I tried to get a grip on reality. The forest was still. The fire from earlier had died out, leaving only faint embers in the dark. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly light over the trees. There was no one, nothing, but I wasn't alone. The whisper didn't stop. It wasn't coming from anywhere, just the air itself, swirling around me like smoke. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing. No figure in the shadows. No person lurking behind the trees. Still, the whispering continued, soft but unyielding. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't understand it. I didn't know where the voice was coming from, why it was repeating my own words. But it was so close, so intimate, that it felt like someone was right next to me. A presence I couldn't escape, no matter how far I ran. I made the decision then. I wasn't staying here any longer. I gathered my things in a daze, my movements mechanical. My hands shook as I packed up the tent, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. I couldn't stay another minute in that cursed place. I left the campsite behind, the sound of the whisper still echoing in my ears as I hiked back toward the car, each step feeling like I was running from something I couldn't even see. As I reached the clearing where the trail began, I stopped and turned back to look at the forest one last time. The trees stood tall, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The forest was silent, but I could still hear it. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. And just before I turned to leave, I saw it, a shadow in the trees, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. Story 7. It was a cold night in late autumn, the kind where the air bites at your skin and every breath seems to carry the chill of the season. I had been hiking for days alone, as I often did when I needed to get away from the noise of the world. The solitude had always been a comfort to me, a way to reset, to let my mind clear and breathe without the constant hum of technology or people. This time, however, the woods were different. There was something about this place, something heavy in the air, that I couldn't shake. I'd set up camp just before sunset, near a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The ground was damp from an earlier rain, the earth thick with the smell of wet leaves and pine. I built a small fire, its crackling flames a welcome warmth against the growing cold. As I sat there, tending to the fire, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker like the shadows shifting in the trees. I turned to look, but there was nothing. A thick fog began to roll in as the night deepened, creeping slowly from the forest floor like a living thing. It wasn't the usual mist I'd seen before, the kind that lingers only for a short time and then fades as quickly as it came. No, this fog was different. It was dense, heavy, and suffocating. I could barely see beyond the reach of the firelight now, and I found myself squinting into the thickening haze, trying to make out any shapes or movement. But the world around me seemed to dissolve into a featureless white. I was used to being alone in the woods, and I knew how the mind can play tricks when you're out here long enough. I told myself it was just the fog, just a natural thing. But that thought didn't hold water for long. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the mist, a darker patch in the fog. But when I focused, I realized something was moving. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. A shape. No, not a shape. A figure. Loomed just beyond the edge of my campfire's light. It was tall, impossibly tall. I could make out the outline of something humanoid, but it didn't walk. It glided across the clearing, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, moving with a fluidity that no human could manage. The air around it seemed to warp, like the fog itself was bending to its will. I froze. My heart beat in my chest like a drum, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't even blink. The figure didn't seem to notice me, or maybe it didn't care. It passed silently, like a shadow, leaving no trace. I wanted to scream, to run, but the terror held me in place like chains. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to rationalize it, to explain it away. It's just the fog, I whispered to myself. Just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. As the figure faded into the mist, I shook myself out of the trance it had put me in and grabbed for my flashlight. I shone it across the clearing, but there was no sign of the thing. Only the fog, swirling and thickening, swallowing everything in its path. The fire flickered, and I huddled closer to it, trying to shake off the sense of dread that had settled over me. The fog didn't lift. It didn't even seem to thin out as the hours passed. It hung in the air, pressing down on me like a physical weight, stifling every breath. I tried to distract myself, fiddling with the fire, trying to keep my mind busy, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that thing. That figure. What was it? What did it want? The thought gnawed at me, turning my stomach, but I tried not to focus on it. After all, I was here alone in the middle of nowhere. There was no one to turn to for help, no one to talk me down from the edge of my panic. I would be fine. I had to be fine. But as the night wore on, I began to hear something else, something I hadn't noticed before. The fog wasn't silent. There were sounds, distant at first, then slowly creeping closer. Slow, deliberate footsteps shuffling through the fog. A faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush, drawing nearer with each passing second. My breath quickened as I realized the footsteps were circling me. I felt them before I heard them. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse raced in my ears. It was coming closer. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the flashlight in my hand like a weapon. I shone it into the fog, but there was nothing. Just thick, swirling white. No figure, no shadow. only the oppressive silence, broken only by the low hiss of the fire and the soft, slow footsteps continuing to circle me. I backed toward my tent, my heart pounding, my thoughts a jumble of fear and disbelief. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I wasn't alone. I tried to ignore the sounds, tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a deer, or something else harmless. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too human. They were waiting, as if whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. I retreated into my tent, sealing the flap as tightly as I could, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The fog was already creeping inside, curling around the edges of the canvas like fingers reaching for me. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head, trying to block out the sounds, trying to ignore the presence that lingered outside, waiting. And then in the dead of the night, I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispered just outside my tent. "Come outside." I froze. My breath caught in my chest as the voice repeated, more insistent this time. "Come outside." I couldn't move. I didn't know if I was hearing things, if the terror had finally pushed my mind over the edge. But I didn't want to find out. I didn't want to give it what it wanted. The footsteps stopped. The fog settled, as if it had never been disturbed. I lay there, trembling, unable to sleep, too afraid to even breathe too deeply. The hours dragged on, the air thick with dread, until the first light of dawn finally broke through the fog. When I emerged from the tent, the clearing was empty. The fog had lifted, and the world looked normal again. Too normal. The only sign that anything had happened was the faint impression of footprints in the wet earth, leading in a wide circle around my campfire. But when I looked closely, I saw something else. The tracks weren't mine. Story 8. Camping alone was supposed to be peaceful, a weekend to unwind, get away from everything. No work, no distractions, just the sound of the forest and the crackle of a campfire. The kind of peace you find only when you're alone with the trees and the sky, far from the noise of the world. But the forest had a way of making you feel small, insignificant. I always thought that was part of its charm, the way it could swallow you whole, make you disappear. But that night, I wish I'd never set foot in the woods. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. The night air was cool, a little too cool, even for late autumn. The ground beneath my sleeping bag was cold, hard, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. I opened my eyes and blinked, trying to adjust to the darkness. The tent around me felt too still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling leaves, maybe a branch cracking, but then I heard it again. Laughter, distant, faint, like 100 voices rising and falling in unison. I froze. It wasn't a sound I was expecting. Not here, not so deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. I strained my ears, hoping it would stop, but the laughter kept coming. Closer now. The voices seemed to grow louder, but they were wrong. They didn't sound like people, not entirely. There was a strange echo to them, a hollow quality, like they weren't coming from anywhere real. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart starting to thud louder in my chest. My breath felt thin, as if the air had turned heavy with the weight of the night. I peered out of the small window of my tent, half expecting to see a group of rowdy campers or hikers, maybe someone just messing around. But the forest was still quiet. There was no fire burning, no light flickering through the trees. Just darkness, and the laughter, that awful, mocking laughter. The sound was coming from all directions now, swirling in the trees, floating in and out like some sick joke. It was as if the very forest itself was laughing at me. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to ignore it, to roll over and pretend it was nothing. But my mind wouldn't let me. Something was off. Something was wrong. The laughter grew, louder now, almost deafening, and my skin began to prickle. It wasn't funny anymore. It was unnerving, chilling, like I was being toyed with. I couldn't take it. I yanked open the zipper of my tent and scrambled out, desperate for air. My feet hit the cold earth with a sharp thud, and I stumbled out into the night. The laughter stopped. Just like that, it vanished. 1 minute it was all around me, the next it was gone. The silence that followed was even worse than the laughter, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I stood there, in the pitch-black void of the woods, my eyes adjusting to the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but when I turned in every direction, I saw nothing. I tried to steady my breathing, to push the anxiety back down into my chest. The darkness felt suffocating, like the trees were closing in on me. I moved a few steps away from the tent, listening, straining my ears for any hint of movement. But there was nothing, no sound, no movement, not even the usual chirp of crickets or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the world had stopped, as if I had become the only thing left in it. And then something shifted, something moved just beyond my peripheral vision, just at the edge of the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped my head toward it, but there was nothing, just the shadows stretching out in the moonlight. I took a few cautious steps forward, my feet crunching softly in the dry leaves. My body tensed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and I felt a sharp chill down my spine, like someone had just walked over my grave. I moved slowly, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but the woods seemed endless. The trees towered over me, thick and oppressive, as if they were closing in. The hair on my neck stood on end. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a glimpse, a shadow, barely visible, flickering just between the trunks of two trees. It was tall, too tall, and it moved in a way that didn't seem human. The figure swayed slightly, like a branch caught in the wind, but there was no wind, no breeze. The laughter, that horrible, haunting laughter, started again, but this time it was different. It was no longer a chorus. It was one voice, one deep, guttural voice that sounded as if it came from the very trees themselves. Come closer. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was as clear as day. It sent a shock through me, cold and raw, like an electric current shooting down my spine. I didn't want to move, but my legs betrayed me, carrying me forward, closer to the shadow. And then it was gone, just vanished, as if the darkness itself had swallowed it whole. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around frantically, trying to find any trace of the thing I had seen, but there was nothing. The forest was still again, as still as a tomb, but I knew I wasn't alone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the blackness, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, to pack up and get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. My body felt like stone, heavy and unyielding. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the laughter returned. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. The sound of 100 voices, all laughing at once, echoing in the woods. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. But the laughter wasn't just from one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding me. The shadows moved, the trees creaked, and the laughter grew louder. I didn't need to see it. I knew it was coming. I ran. I didn't care about the forest anymore. I didn't care about my tent, my gear, or the trail I'd come from. All I knew was that I needed to get out. The trees seemed to close in around me as I bolted through the dark, my feet tripping over roots and rocks. The laughter, that maddening, insane laughter, was all around me now, echoing in my ears, drowning out everything else. When I finally broke through the trees and into the clearing, I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know how long I ran, but when I looked back at the forest, the shadows were gone. The laughter had stopped. The woods were silent, but I knew I wasn't alone, and I never would be again. I left the woods the next morning, left everything behind, but every time I close my eyes, I hear it, the laughter echoing in the distance, waiting, always waiting. Story 9. It started off like any other night in the woods. I was out on a solo camping trip, something I did to get away from the noise of life. You know, the kind of noise that keeps your mind spinning and your heart racing for no real reason. The night was cool, the air crisp with that clean scent that only comes from the wild. The stars hung in the sky like perfect diamonds, too bright to ignore, too beautiful to look away from. I had set up my tent by a small clearing near a stream. The only sounds I could hear were the gentle flow of water and the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you only get when you're truly alone in nature. I zipped up the tent, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat there for a while, letting the quiet seep into my bones. It wasn't long before I decided to crawl into my sleeping bag and call it a night. I turned off my flashlight, snuggled into the warmth of my bag, and closed my eyes. The air was colder now, the warmth of the day slowly ebbing away as night took its full hold on the forest. My body relaxed, the weight of the day lifting from my shoulders, and soon the slow rhythm of my breath was all I could hear. That's when I felt it. At first, it was just a slight pressure against the floor of the tent, a soft, almost imperceptible push that I brushed off as nothing more than the wind shifting the fabric, maybe the shifting of my own weight as I settled deeper into the bag. But then it happened again, only this time it was stronger. The pressure grew, like something was slowly pressing against the underside of my tent. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a curious deer. I told myself it was nothing to be afraid of. Wild animals were a part of the forest, and they had no interest in me as long as I didn't pose a threat. But then the pressure turned into something else, something more deliberate. It was no longer just the weight of the earth beneath me shifting. There was a motion, a purposeful movement. And then I felt it. Fingers. The tips of something cold and unnervingly delicate pressed up against the fabric of the tent, stretching it ever so slightly. They were slow, deliberate, and methodical, as if something was poking at me from underneath. The fingers moved across the fabric, sending a jolt of icy terror through my chest. I froze. My heartbeat, which had been steady in calm moments before, now slammed against my ribs. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if they had a mind of their own. I could feel my throat tighten, but I couldn't make a sound. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to acknowledge what was happening, but I couldn't ignore it. The fingers pressed harder against the tent floor, stretching the fabric even further. I felt the move across my body, not touching me, but moving under me, beneath me. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was just the wind again, maybe I was imagining it. But the truth was, I wasn't on a platform. There was nothing beneath me. No rocks, no roots, nothing to explain the sensation of those fingers crawling beneath me. The pressure was too distinct, too real. My breath caught in my throat. I shot up, heart pounding, the air suddenly feeling too thick to breathe. I scrambled to unzip the tent, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grab the zipper. When I finally managed to pull it open, I shot out of the tent, stumbling into the cool night air, my pulse still racing in my ears. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked around, expecting to see some animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the clearing was empty. The trees were still, the wind had died down, and the ground was undisturbed. Nothing. The moonlight painted the landscape in pale light, casting long shadows across the grass, but there was no sign of movement. No creature creeping through the underbrush, no shadow lurking at the edge of the trees, just the silence of the night. But the strangest thing? The ground. It didn't feel right. The dirt beneath my boots seemed uneven. It was shifting just slightly, as though something was moving beneath the earth just out of reach. I crouched down and placed my hand on the ground, feeling the earth tremble under my fingers. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, a faint ripple, like something crawling beneath the surface. I stood up quickly, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the ground, my eyes flicking between the tent and the earth beneath me. It was like something or someone was hiding under the dirt, waiting for the right moment to surface. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, followed by a low, guttural growl. I snapped my head around, but all I saw were the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. The growl wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Deep, rumbling, primal. It didn't come from the sky or the woods. No, it came from beneath the ground, vibrating the earth beneath me. My mind raced. I wanted to run. I should have run. But my legs felt rooted to the spot, as if the ground itself was holding me there. The scraping grew louder, closer, until it sounded as if something was clawing its way up from beneath me. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or even a snake. No, this was something else, something older, something that didn't belong to this world. Without thinking, I bolted, running as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to see what was crawling out of the earth beneath me. I ran for what felt like miles, my breath ragged and my body aching, but I didn't stop. I kept going, my mind screaming at me to get away, to get as far from the tent as possible. When I finally stopped, hours later, I found myself standing at the edge of a road, miles from where I'd set up camp. I didn't even know how I got there. I never went back. The tent? I left it there. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that spot, to face whatever had been beneath me. And to this day, when I close my eyes, I can still feel those fingers pressing against the bottom of the tent, stretching the fabric like a hand reaching for something far darker than I ever could have imagined. Story 10. It was the kind of day that felt off from the moment I stepped into the woods. It was too quiet. No birds. No rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just the heavy silence that you get when something's wrong. I had been walking for hours looking for a place to camp when I found it. A small clearing, but there was something in the center of it that made my heart skip. A mirror. It wasn't just any mirror. No, it was old. Old in a way that seemed impossible for something to be, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. The glass was cracked along the edges, and dust had settled thick on its surface. The frame was twisted, made of something that looked like iron, but it had long since rusted into a deep, unnatural brown. It stood there, planted in the dirt like it had always been meant to be there, as if the forest had grown around it and accepted it as part of the landscape. I've heard stories, of course. Everyone who spends enough time in the woods does. Tales of things that don't belong, of things that watch from just beyond the trees. But I wasn't about to let an old mirror scare me. So, I approached it. The air felt thick as I stepped closer, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. That's when I saw the reflection. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I mean, it was a mirror, right? So I expected to see myself. But the reflection wasn't mine. It wasn't even close. A man stood there, a pale man, his skin almost too white, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were hollow, dark pits staring straight at me, like a window into nothing. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, like he hadn't eaten in days, or maybe longer. His clothes were torn, old, and ragged, like something out of an old ghost story. But it was his smile that made me freeze. It wasn't a normal smile. It wasn't even a welcoming smile. It was crooked, stretched too far, and there was something about it, something twisted and wrong, like he knew something I did, a secret that I wasn't meant to know. I jerked back, instinctively looking over my shoulder to see if the man was behind me, but the forest was empty. The trees stood silent, unmoving, as they had always been. There was no one there. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror, my breath quickening, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But the man was still there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. And this time, he was smiling wider. I felt a chill creep up my spine, a coldness that wasn't from the wind. I couldn't look away, though. The longer I stared at him, the more I felt like I was losing control, like the mirror was pulling me in. It was as if the man was waiting for me to step forward, to come closer. His smile stretched farther now, and it was almost as if he was trying to say something, something I couldn't hear but felt deep inside my chest. I took a step back, my legs shaking, but the mirror seemed to follow me. No matter how far I stepped, I couldn't escape that damn reflection. The man's smile grew even wider, and I could swear his eyes flickered with something like recognition. That's when I realized he knew me. I wasn't sure how, but the way he stared at me, it was like he had always known me, like we were tied together somehow. I felt a rush of panic, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. I wanted to run, to get away from that mirror, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though I was rooted to the spot, held by his gaze. Then, for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something else behind him in the reflection. A shadow, moving in the background, just beyond the man's pale form. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the shadow was gone as quickly as it appeared. I tore my eyes away from the mirror, heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, desperate to break the hold it had on me. But when I looked back at the clearing, the mirror was still there, standing tall and silent. There was no man. There was nothing at all. But the air felt heavier now. The silence had thickened, pressing against me. I could still feel the cold eyes of that man, even though I couldn't see him anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't keep looking at that thing, whatever it was. It had to be a trick of my mind, right? Just my imagination running wild. I turned to leave, but as I stepped away, I heard something. It was a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, slow chuckle coming from behind me. I turned around, expecting to see the man again, but the mirror was empty. The woods were still. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the silence still thick in the air. I was about to turn and walk away when I caught a glimpse of something else in the reflection. A shadow. No, not just a shadow. It was him, the man, standing behind me, just on the edge of the mirror's frame. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The forest was as it should be, silent, empty, and darkening as the sun began to set. But when I looked back at the mirror, I saw him clearly now. The man with hollow eyes, his face twisted in that sickening smile. And then he winked. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, my breath ragged, my heart racing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, following me, that I hadn't escaped it. I don't know what the man wanted. I don't know if he's still out there, waiting for me to return. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget his smile. Because I know, deep down, he's still out there, watching, waiting. And the next time, he won't be in the mirror.